wanted to know a little bit if in your work lately, I know you've been visiting several countries in this last few years.
Mm,
What kind of reaction or information you had from the stakeholders you spoke with during your field work? How social media platforms are operating in their countries. Is that
mm.
that's has surfaced, or what other aspects related to new and emerging technologies that you would say are of importance?
Thank you so much also for asking this kind of question because, as you already mentioned, I had a couple of country missions lately. So, but we also have to go maybe one step back again, which means access to the labor market. Access to the labor market is very difficult for most of the older persons because there are so many biases around here. And even if they might have the right education and also the vocational training and everything, they have very less chances to get the job in the end. This is true for all, I would say, all the different economies, but especially for tech economies. They totally focus on younger personnel and don't see that there are older people which have a huge potential also to open them new markets for older persons themselves. And I think this is totally underestimated also from the service providers. And what I also recently saw quite clearly is that there are non-discrimination laws emerging also on national levels, which take into account that discrimination based on age is also due for labor market accessing tech markets. So also these kind of social media platforms need to consider how to approach older, let's say, workers in a way, or older constituencies to give them also their wisdom and knowledge, because otherwise we also see that a lot of artificial intelligence applications are already biased in regard of age, which also needs to be considered as ageism in a way and needs to be tackled from our point of view.
Yes, I remember you mentioned that a couple of years ago when you were at the General Assembly in New York, precisely that there is a lot of effort on the part of UN institutions and bodies to bring the youth to the fold, right? Which makes sense. But at the same time, there seems to be a certain neglect of the older generations, which actually contributed to the UN what it is today, right? Both in paying taxes and also in contributions as volunteers or other kind of work that supported the United Nations. So tell us a little bit what is happening right now, what kind of reaction you have received from other UN institutions and the Office of the UN Secretary General regarding intergenerational events and ways of bringing together both the older or experienced generation with the youth.
Mm-hmm. What we see right now is currently that still the focus is on youth, which, as you said before, also makes sense to get them into the loop, to have them as a new constituency around the UN and also focus on our democracy. But nevertheless, there is a huge reluctance to also engage the older part of our population, which is also not quite fair for those youngers of today because they will be the oldest of tomorrow. In this regard, I also think that the approach with full focus in all the different agencies around the UN is also not fair. Because if the older population, as you said, they were the ones who also built the UN, they contributed to make the UN work, not only as volunteers, but also as professionals, but never seeing their own constituencies as part of one group, which might also be on risk as a vulnerable situation in vulnerable situations. And I think this also needs to be changed. And I see this quite clearly also when I travel around the world in my country missions, that there are less programs focusing on older persons. It doesn't matter if I take into consideration the labor market or the healthcare sector or education. the older population is really not taken into account when it comes also to support very often from UN agencies. We very often miss this part of programming, and this is also quite difficult nowadays. If we see these huge crises in regard, for example, climate crisis, they have a lot of impact on older populations and older people around the world. But the emergency plans are not set up to consider how to support older people who might need a little bit more support than other parts of the population, or how shelters take them in, or also how to get the information. There we are coming back to our technology issues. If the information is only given through smartphones, a lot of older population are not part of this community and don't get the information in the right time. So I think this also needs to be considered as a kind of emergency, how to get the information to our older population, which were the ones who built the UN and the world as well. So from the perspective of how can we further and foster the intergenerational approach, I think there is a lot which can be done. One thing is to include the older persons, to participate, to give them also some space. Nowadays, we do have all these wonderful examples where we have youth delegates joining the General Assembly, high-level panel discussions. But where are the delegates of the older part of the population? This would also be a very welcomed approach, I would say, to have a younger delegate and an older one, and have this kind of exchange. Then both would learn from each other and also learn again to listen to each other. Because if the gap between the generation is getting bigger and bigger, what we see nowadays very often, I think it's also quite hard for them to work together as a whole society. And I think what we really need to focus is inclusion of all, which also needs to be taken into consideration when setting up programs and setting up also support systems.
And the relevance of education too, in terms of approaching, creating programs within the UN agencies that will include the voices of older generations, and also what kind of instructional materials they are interested in, right? It is so important bringing them to the digital age, but sometimes not necessarily, because as we know, everything that can be digitized will be digitized, but not everything that can be digitized should be digitized. We still need people-to-people connections, right? And I think that's an opportunity there also for UN agencies to bring together these generations to understand each other better, because there is a lot of bias within the tech community of young people that the older people cannot deal with technology, or they can't get it, understand it, which isn't true at all, because if you look at the social strata, actually higher income individuals who are older are very tech savvy, right? Because they have the money to buy the latest gadget, the latest iPhone, and you name it, right? Whether it's really a matter of socioeconomic access to digital, just like the young people, they are not necessarily, if they are, under a lot of socioeconomic stress, they can't afford phones, their parents cannot afford for them to have the latest computers at home to study. They don't know much about technology either, right? It's a matter really of access, of a socioeconomic opportunity, right? So there is a great opportunity there. But tell me a little bit now, to wrap it up, about your experience. Which countries have you visited in the last year or so? And do you have any experiences of good practices that you have identified?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for asking. Last year, I have visited Moldova, for example, where they already set up a very good intergenerational approach in regard of learning from each other, and they set up programs that younger people teach older persons how to use their smartphone, which is supported by one of the providers in the country. So they really brought them to also bridge the economical barrier. They brought them new smartphones also with SIM cards to have real access to these kind of services now, which is already one quite interesting step. to see that there are also solutions. Another very good example I also saw where digital tools can really support also older people was in Bangladesh, where they have an app which can also be used from a regular phone, not only a smartphone, which is very expensive, where they got delivered their allowances. So also in very rural areas, older people and also older women have their smartphone where they get their allowances provided as a social support service system, which worked quite well. Otherwise, they would have had to travel a day or longer to collect their social support. So I think these are two very good examples where on the one hand we see intergenerational approach and on the other hand that there are solutions which work quite well and seem to really work for everybody in the country. This month we are approaching New York again for the next session of the Open-Ended Working Group on Aging, where we are still discussing how can older persons get the best support in regard of their human rights? And one of the solutions would be a human rights convention on the rights of older persons, which from my experience and what I also see around the world would also guide member states how to integrate older persons in the digital world, in the world of environmental disaster management, and also other new ideas or all the new crises which are coming across our discussions nowadays. So
there is not an UN agency, right? We have a UN agency for women to protect women's rights and
for children,
children, and there is no UN agency that could deal with these issues. There's this film actually that is going to be shown actually in one of the events upcoming in New York. So like older but not over.
Exactly. That's exactly this campaign. Because of the New York meeting we're having now to get the convention. So a lot of older persons also say, we should start drafting, or the UN should start, the member states should start drafting now, and not only talking, because the Open-Ended Working Group now started in 2010. So 14 years of discussion, and I would say we know it all. We just need to solve the gaps and the problems.
So there is a text already.
No, unfortunately not.
Oh, we have to start drafting it. But so the open-ended working group proceedings start next week.
Yeah, we are still hoping that we get more support for older people, because as you said, we don't have an agency for older people. There is now also a youth office in New York, but there is nothing for older people. The only thing we achieved is a interagency working group, which is all. And there is the mandate, which I'm right now the mandate holder, and that's the whole thing in the whole UN.